I am Ethan Vance, 34 years old. A few years ago, I stood in the dim, heavily shadowed corner of a massive, incredibly expensive ballroom at my own brother's wedding, listening to him publicly mock my entire life's work in front of every single person we knew. And while I was standing there, holding a generic club soda and actively trying to remain completely invisible against the expensive wallpaper, my parents were parading him around the room like a prized million-dollar racehorse. They laughed loudly, their chests puffed out with immense pride, as my brother looked right at me. He was completely surrounded by his wealthy, arrogant friends from his corporate job, and he sneered at me. He told me I was a poor little brother, still hiding in corners at parties. He told me I was still stuck at a tiny, worthless firm while the rest of the family was building real, tangible careers. He humiliated me right there, in front of hundreds of people who looked at me with nothing but raw, unfiltered pity. But there was one massive thing they did not know. They had absolutely no idea that the tiny firm he was so loudly joking about had just quietly orchestrated a multimillion-dollar corporate takeover of his entire industry. And they certainly did not know that in exactly 3 minutes, the powerful, untouchable CEO they were all currently kissing up to was going to walk over, turn completely pale, drop his glass, and start calling me his boss. Now, years later, they are the ones leaving desperate, weeping voicemails on my phone, begging for a second chance. Before I tell you exactly how that glorious, earth-shattering disaster unfolded, hit that like button if you believe that true justice always finds a way to reveal itself. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let us go back to the exact moment the trap was finally sprung. The air inside the Ashworth Manor ballroom was impossibly thick. It smelled heavily of imported white lilies, expensive French perfume, and the distinct metallic scent of old money. Crystal chandeliers, massive and ostentatious, dripped from the vaulted ceilings like frozen, glittering waterfalls. They cast an oppressively bright, unforgiving light on the sea of wealthy guests moving below. You have to understand, this was not just a wedding. It was a loud, aggressive statement. It was a hostile declaration of the Vance family's permanent arrival into high society. The entire evening was meticulously orchestrated to celebrate its undisputed crown prince, my older brother, Julian. Standing there, I felt like a dirty smudge on a pristine masterpiece painting. My suit was a deep, rich charcoal. It was custom-tailored in London, woven from heavy English wool, and was easily the most expensive piece of clothing I had ever owned in my life. But it was designed for a boardroom where brutal corporate decisions were made, not a flamboyant ballroom. It was quiet. It was intentionally understated. And in that room, full of rented tuxedos and flashy designer gowns, quiet was the exact same thing as being completely invisible. It took my mother, Margaret, less than 5 minutes to spot me lingering near the ornate mahogany bar. Her smile was incredibly tight. It was a masterful work of social engineering that completely failed to reach her cold eyes. She glided towards me, her heavily beaded, silver dress shimmering under the harsh chandelier lights. She stopped 2 feet away and scanned me from head to toe. I could physically feel the mental checklist of my endless deficiencies being aggressively ticked off in her head. She did not ask how I was doing. She immediately told me I looked tired. She adjusted my perfectly straight tie and told me I needed to mingle with the guests. She said it looked incredibly strange for a member of the immediate family to be standing completely alone in a dark corner. She told me people at the country club would talk, and she could not afford any gossip on Julian's big day. I looked at her, my face completely blank, and told her to let them talk. Her artificial smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her eyes hardened. She leaned in close and warned me not to be difficult. She told me to grab a glass of champagne, paste a smile on my face, and try to look like I actually belonged there. She did not even wait for a reply. She was already turning on her heel to enthusiastically greet the wife of some senior real estate partner. Her dazzling, completely fake smile instantly restored. I stood there, feeling the familiar, heavy cold knot tightening in the pit of my stomach. It was a deeply ingrained feeling I had known my entire life. It was the isolating feeling of being the absolute wrong shape for the perfect puzzle my family was obsessively trying to solve. Then, cutting through the dense crowd, I saw them. Julian and his new bride, Victoria. They were the ultimate golden couple. They were laughing loudly, glowing under the attention, and accepting endless congratulations like ancient monarchs receiving tribute from their loyal subjects. I knew it was only a matter of time before he found me. Julian loved an audience, and I was his favorite prop. He swaggered over, smelling strongly of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. He slung a heavy, aggressively proprietary arm around my shoulder and announced to his large circle of groomsmen that the mysterious tech mogul had finally arrived. His tone was absolutely drenched in sarcasm. Victoria, who was undeniably beautiful but incredibly brittle, gave a little condescending laugh. She patted Julian's chest and told him to be nice. She looked at me with deep pity and said she thought my little consulting firm was very brave. The word brave was delivered with such thick condescension, it sounded exactly like a synonym for doomed. Julian made sure his voice carried over the elegant string quartet playing in the background. He wanted the surrounding tables to hear this. He asked me if my busy schedule playing with computers was ever going to pay for a wedding like this. He swept a hand through the air to indicate the sheer, overwhelming opulence of the massive room, the towering floral arrangements, and the open bar. He told me I was still stuck at a tiny, irrelevant firm while the rest of the adults in the room were building real careers with actual salaries and massive bonuses. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I did not break eye contact. I looked at my older brother, a man who genuinely, deeply believed he had earned a luxurious life that had been entirely gift-wrapped and handed to him by our parents. I looked at his gorgeous bride, whose powerful family name and massive real estate holdings were secretly the single biggest asset on Julian's otherwise incredibly mediocre resume. I knew something they did not know. I knew that in exactly 20 minutes, his boss, the CEO of Blackwood Financial, a ruthless man named Richard Blackwood, was scheduled to arrive through those double doors. And I knew that his highly anticipated arrival would be the exact spark needed to finally ignite a decade's worth of bone-dry tinder. They looked at me and thought this was their glorious night. They had absolutely no idea it was actually mine. But to truly understand the beautiful, catastrophic explosion that was about to happen right there on the polished marble floor, you have to understand exactly what that explosion was built on. You have to go back 10 excruciating years. You have to go back to the exact day I lost $50,000, and the day I finally brutally realized my family was never, ever going to love me the way they loved him. 10 years ago, I was 24 years old. I was living in a cramped, freezing third-floor walk-up apartment that constantly smelled of cheap instant coffee and old, damp carpets. But I was not depressed. I had an idea that kept me awake at night, my brain buzzing with electric, undeniable excitement. I had designed a complex software architecture that could completely revolutionize supply chain management for large-scale retail companies. It was highly predictive. It was incredibly efficient. And if built correctly, it was going to change the entire industry. I spent 6 grueling months of my life chained to a cheap, wobbly desk. I lived entirely on generic ramen noodles and cold coffee. I sacrificed sleep, friendships, and any semblance of a normal 20s lifestyle to turn that abstract software idea into a viable, ironclad business plan. I mapped out aggressive market penetration strategies. I built conservative 5-year growth projections. I calculated precise staffing requirements. I poured my absolute soul into a dense, 40-page document held together by a simple, cheap blue binder. The night I presented that binder to my parents felt like the absolute most important night of my entire life. We were at their large suburban house, sitting around the polished mahogany dining table. This was the exact same table where so many of Julian's incredibly mediocre, average achievements had been wildly and loudly celebrated. My father, William, sat at the head of the table. He was a man who saw the world only in black and white certainties, strict corporate hierarchies, and 6-figure salary brackets. His face was a mask of harsh judicial skepticism before I even opened my mouth. My mother fidgeted with her linen napkin, already looking profoundly bored and annoyed that I was cutting into her evening television time. Julian lounged lazily in the doorway, a smug, punchable grin playing on his lips as he casually watched the show unfold. I was nervous, my hands actually shaking slightly, but I was deeply passionate. I spoke about predictive algorithms and data analytics. I laid out the flawless logic. I showed them the math. And then I finally got to the ask. I made it very clear I was not asking for a handout or a gift. I was asking for a formal investment. I needed a $20,000 loan to build the initial working prototype and secure our very first major corporate client. When I finished speaking and closed the blue binder, the silence in the dining room was completely deafening. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the house. My father cleared his throat loudly. He used that patient, incredibly weary voice of a seasoned man explaining something painfully obvious to a very slow, delusional child. He told me it was an interesting concept for a college project, perhaps, but the real world did not run on faddish, unpredictable ideas. He told me the entire tech sector was a dangerous gamble, a bubble waiting to burst. He pointed a stiff finger directly at Julian, who was still smirking in the doorway. He said Julian was in the real world, working for a prestigious firm that had been a pillar of the financial community for a century. He looked me dead in the eye, tapped my blue binder, and said my business plan was nothing but a garbage lottery ticket. My mother sighed dramatically, rubbing her temples. She said they worried about me constantly. She complained that they had invested so much money into my college fund, and for me to just throw my degree away on some silly computer game seemed like a massive, heartbreaking waste. And then she dropped the ultimate line, the phrase that had defined my entire miserable youth. She looked at me with deep disappointment and asked, "Ethan, why can't you just be more like Julian?" The meeting was officially over. My father stood up, pushed his chair back, and told me to be realistic and get a real job. I packed up my blue binder, walked out into the freezing rain, and drove back to my terrible apartment. Exactly 2 weeks later, I was scrolling through my social media feed when I saw the pictures. Julian was grinning from ear to ear, holding a glass of champagne on a luxurious first-class flight to Italy. The caption, posted proudly by my mother, read that he absolutely deserved a lavish trip to broaden his cultural horizons before he conquered the corporate world. They did not have $20,000 to invest in my actual future, but they easily had more than $30,000 in liquid cash to fund his European vacation. I slowly closed my laptop. I put the blue binder in my bottom desk drawer. I finally realized the brutal truth. They did not invest in dreams or potential. They invested in sure things, in social status, and in appearances. And I was not a sure thing. I went completely underground. I took a grueling, soul-crushing generic tech job during the day just to pay my rent and buy groceries. But my real work started at 8 at night and ended at 3 in the morning. I sacrificed everything. Every single spare dollar I made was aggressively funneled into a high-yield savings account. I guarded that money like a starving wolf. Over 3 brutal, lonely years, I saved up exactly $50,000. It was my launch capital. It was my hard-earned ticket to absolute freedom. And then came the phone call. My mother called me late on a Tuesday evening. Her voice was a syrupy, perfectly calculated blend of fake maternal concern and heavy manipulation. She started by telling me Julian was miraculously on the shortlist for a massive vice president promotion at his financial firm. But there was a catch. To guarantee the promotion, the senior partners strongly suggested he get a fast-tracked MBA from a highly prestigious top-tier school. She sighed heavily into the phone, complaining bitterly about how incredibly expensive the tuition was. She mentioned their upcoming country club membership dues, the high property taxes on their estate, and the rising cost of living. Then she dropped the hammer. She said she knew I was frugal and never spent money on myself. She asked for my entire savings. The blood completely drained from my face. My heart hammered against my ribs. I gripped the phone and told her that money was strictly for my company. I told her it was everything I had in the world. She immediately shifted tactics. She cooed at me, her voice dripping with toxic, false sympathy. She told me to think of it as an investment in the family's legacy. She promised that Julian's new executive salary would be astronomical and he would pay me back in a matter of months with generous interest. She expertly painted me into a tight corner, making it painfully clear that if I said no, I would permanently be the selfish, jealous villain deliberately holding back the family's golden child. Against every screaming, logical instinct in my body, the desperate little boy inside me who just wanted his mother to love him finally caved. I met Julian at a loud coffee shop to hand over the cashier's check. He swaggered in 20 minutes late, talking loudly on his phone about a weekend golf trip. He barely made eye contact with me as he snatched the check from the table. He glanced at the $50,000 amount, told me I was a total lifesaver, and casually promised to pay it back. He folded my entire life's work into his designer jacket pocket and spent the next 20 minutes complaining to me about his annoying HOA meetings. I thought that was the absolute worst of it. I was incredibly wrong. 6 months later, a mutual college friend posted a photo from a weekend gathering. There was Julian, wearing expensive sunglasses, leaning casually against the hood of a brand-new, custom-ordered Porsche 911. The caption congratulated Julian on his new toy. He had not just used my money for his MBA tuition. He had used my blood, my sweat, and my endless sleepless nights to quietly finance his ridiculous, fragile ego. That $50,000 vanished into thin air. The loan was never mentioned again by anyone in the family. I was completely, utterly broken. I had absolutely nothing left. But in the Vance family portrait, there was exactly one figure who always understood me. My grandfather, Benjamin. He was a master carpenter. While my father built a stressful career aggressively climbing corporate ladders and stepping on people, my grandfather built solid, tangible, beautiful things with his rough, calloused hands. His dusty workshop smelled of rich cedar and warm varnish, and it was the only place on earth I ever felt truly safe. Before he passed away, his health failing rapidly, he called me to his bedside. He did not offer grand, sweeping speeches. He simply reached over and gave me his old wristwatch. It was a beat-up, heavily scratched timepiece with a faded leather strap held together in one spot by a piece of black electrical tape. It was financially worthless, but to me it was priceless. He fastened it to my wrist with trembling hands. He looked me in the eye and told me to be exactly like the watch. He told me to be honest, to just do the work and to ignore the noise. His funeral was incredibly somber, but entirely fake. My father stood at the podium and gave a eulogy that was polite, but deeply tinged with a subtle, arrogant pity for my grandfather's simple, working-class life. It physically disgusted me to watch them use his death as a networking event, whispering about real estate and stock portfolios over his casket. After the funeral, my Aunt Evelyn handed me a worn, leather-bound notebook from his workshop. Tucked inside the pages was a yellowed piece of paper, a note he had left specifically for me. It read, "Ethan, a man's worth isn't what he has in the bank. It is what he builds. Go build something great. I believe in you." That short note and that old, scratched watch were my true inheritance. I taped the note above my computer monitor. I wore the watch every single day. I took that burning, violent rage, that profound sense of betrayal regarding the Porsche 911 and the stolen $50,000, and I weaponized it. I completely stopped wanting their approval. I wanted to build an absolute empire. The long years immediately following my grandfather's funeral were a relentless blur of punishing, exhausting labor. I did not just start over from scratch. I completely mutated. My dream went totally underground, buried deep out of sight from anyone who shared my last name. That little blue binder I had presented at the dining room table slowly evolved into a corporate entity called Nexus Tech. And I did not build it alone. I brought in a woman named Maya Lin to be my chief operating officer. Maya was brilliant, entirely ruthless, and the only person on earth who knew the full, ugly truth about my toxic family dynamic. We started our operation with 2 incredibly cheap desks crammed into a rented, unheated garage, literally living off sheer, unadulterated spite and cheap diner food. Fast forward to the present day. Nexus Tech was no longer a scrappy, desperate startup struggling to keep the lights on. We were a massive, silent giant in the industry. We had sleek, glass-walled offices in 3 major cities, a staggering valuation pushing deep into the 9 figures, and a terrifying, legendary reputation in the corporate world for executing flawless, aggressive acquisitions. My daily life was a non-stop whirlwind of high-stakes commercial real estate deals, massive payroll expansions, and international flights. But to my family, I was still just Ethan. I was still the quirky, struggling computer guy they politely tolerated and deeply pitied at Thanksgiving dinners. The tense weeks leading up to Julian's lavish wedding were an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare. My family's phone calls were like bizarre dispatches from an alternate reality where I was still a total failure. The most infuriating call came from my Aunt Evelyn. She was my mother's sister and the family's undisputed chief gossip and intelligence officer. She called me on a quiet Sunday morning, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and fake concern. She sang loudly into the phone, telling me in excruciating detail how the exotic floral arrangements alone for Victoria and Julian's wedding cost more than most people's luxury cars. She aggressively gushed over Julian's supposed massive success, his new corner office, and his astronomical salary. Then, with practiced precision, she slipped the knife in. She said it must be so incredibly hard for me, seeing my older brother completely conquer the world while I was still trying to get my little computer hobby off the ground in my apartment. Every single word she spoke was a perfectly crafted, highly intentional insult wrapped tightly in a sugary coating of pity. I simply thanked her for her deep concern and hung up the phone. Then came Liam. Liam used to be a decent guy. He was a close friend from college who actually borrowed rent money from me back in the day when he was dead broke. But Liam eventually figured out that aggressively flattering Julian was a much faster way up the corporate ladder. He had abandoned our friendship and secured a job as Julian's glorified assistant at Blackwood Financial. Liam mailed me the formal wedding invitation with a handwritten sticky note attached to the heavy cardstock. It said, "Ethan, try to dress nice, man. A lot of heavy hitters will be there. Don't embarrass him." The sheer, blinding audacity of a guy who used to sleep on my dirty couch telling me how to dress for a networking event was almost comical. Julian's own phone call was exactly what I expected it to be. He called me from his office on a speakerphone, deliberately making sure I could hear the bustling, important sounds of corporate business happening in the background. He offered me some friendly advice. He told me to keep my mouth completely shut about my tech stuff at the reception because it came off as needy and desperate to successful people. He explicitly told me to stick to talking about the weather or sports so I wouldn't accidentally drag his sterling reputation down in front of his bosses. I absorbed all the slights. I absorbed the endless condescension. I did not argue, because they had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 8 grueling months quietly rewriting the entire script of their lives. The single phone call that changed the entire strategic landscape of my revenge came late on a Tuesday night. I was standing alone in the cavernous Nexus Tech boardroom, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering city skyline, meticulously reviewing the final financial blueprints for Project Nightingale. Nightingale was our highly classified internal code name for the complete, hostile takeover of Blackwood Financial. We had spent months quietly buying up vulnerable shares through shell companies and securing disgruntled shareholder support. The final, killing move was scheduled to execute on the Monday morning immediately following the wedding. Suddenly, my private, encrypted cell phone rang. It was an unlisted number. Very few people had this number. I answered, and a gruff, incredibly impatient voice barked through the speaker. "Ethan Vance. This is Harrison Sterling." I physically froze in place. Harrison Sterling. He was Victoria's incredibly wealthy father. He was a ruthless titan of industry, a man who possessed massive commercial real estate holdings, and a senior voting member on the board of directors at Blackwood Financial. My mind instantly went to red alert. I assumed he had somehow discovered the secret takeover bid and was calling to threaten me with a massive, crippling lawsuit to protect his future son-in-law. I kept my voice dead calm, masking my racing heart. "Mr. Sterling, this is a surprise." He told me to cut the crap immediately. He said he had been sitting on ruthless corporate boards longer than I had been alive, and he knew exactly what an executioner's song sounded like when he heard it. He had seen the subtle market whispers of Project Nightingale. He knew my plan was bold, highly aggressive, and entirely likely to succeed. I said nothing, waiting for the heavy threat to drop. But the threat never came. Harrison Sterling told me the old guard at Blackwood Financial were proud, sentimental, outdated fools who would much rather go down with the sinking ship than admit they were financially bankrupt. He said he, on the exact other hand, was a cold pragmatist whose absolute only loyalty was to his own bottom line and his family's wealth. I asked him what his bottom line was telling him right now. His response completely shifted the earth beneath my feet. He told me his bottom line told him that his future son-in-law, Julian, was a charismatic, arrogant, utterly useless idiot who had been promoted far, far beyond his actual level of competence. He said Julian was a massive liability who spent significantly more time posing with his ridiculous Porsche than actually looking at crucial financial spreadsheets. He revealed that a huge portion of his family's inheritance and the college funds for his future grandchildren were deeply tied up in Blackwood stock. Stock that Julian was actively driving straight into the ground. Harrison did not want to stop my hostile takeover. He wanted to aggressively accelerate it. He told me he was fully aware of the ironclad prenuptial agreement protecting his daughter's assets. He said a messy, highly public divorce in a year, followed by a nasty custody battle and endless lawsuits over assets when Julian inevitably bankrupted himself, would be a total public relations disaster for the Sterling family brand. He wanted a quiet, ruthlessly managed transition under competent new ownership. My ownership. He told me to push the financial deal through fast. He told me the entire senior executive team, including the arrogant CEO Richard Blackwood, would be at the wedding reception, fat, happy, and incredibly drunk on cheap champagne. Harrison basically handed me the keys to the entire kingdom. He told me to introduce myself to the board directly at the reception. He wanted me to rattle their cages. He wanted me to let the bleeding sharks see exactly who was circling their yacht. When the line finally went dead, I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. The game had flipped entirely on its head. This was no longer just a hostile corporate takeover. It was a fully sanctioned execution, and I had the absolute tactical high ground. I immediately called Maya Lin into my office and told her we were moving the timeline up. I told her I was going to the wedding, and I was going to burn their entire stage to the ground. The morning of the wedding was strangely, beautifully serene. The city outside my penthouse window was quiet, completely draped in the soft, gray light of early dawn. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood looking out at the waking skyline. I knew with absolute certainty that across town, my parents' house was an absolute hive of frantic, highly controlled chaos. I could easily picture the stressed hairstylists, the panicked makeup artists, the endless screaming over misplaced boutonnieres, and my mother viciously barking orders at terrified catering staff. My own preparation was a quiet, intensely methodical ritual. I did not blast loud music to pump myself up. I moved with the cold, calculated precision of a trauma surgeon preparing for a highly complex, life-saving operation. I had carefully laid out my suit the night before. It was a bespoke charcoal masterpiece, cut perfectly from heavy English wool by an exclusive tailor in London. It did not have the shiny, cheap flash of the rented, ill-fitting tuxedos my brother and his loud groomsmen would be wearing. It was a suit designed specifically to convey absolute, unspoken authority. It was the heavy armor of a man who owned the entire room before he even walked through the door. After taking a long shower, I sat at my sleek desk and opened the massive Blackwood financial acquisition file one last time. I mentally rehearsed the key data points until they were burned into my memory. I memorized their abysmal, embarrassing revenue decline over the last 3 fiscal years. I looked at the grossly bloated executive salary structure that rewarded failure. I memorized the catastrophic performance numbers of the exact logistics division Julian was supposed to be expertly managing. I was not preparing for a joyful family reunion. I was preparing for a brutal, hostile shareholder meeting. Before I left the apartment, I opened a locked, heavily encrypted folder on my laptop. Inside was a single, high-resolution scanned document. It was the email exchange from exactly 10 years ago. The email where I explicitly detailed the $50,000 loan to my mother, and her explicit, undeniable reply, "Thank you, honey. You are a lifesaver. Julian will pay you back with interest." It was not a notarized legal contract, but it was absolute, undeniable proof of their betrayal. It was the digital ghost of a broken promise. I saved a copy directly to the home screen of my phone, ready to be deployed. Finally, I picked up my grandfather's watch. I fastened the faded, heavily frayed leather strap to my wrist. The cool metal felt like a heavy anchor grounding me in reality, reminding me exactly why I was doing this. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I saw a man entirely forged in the blazing fire of his family's utter indifference, entirely ready to bring the heat right back to their front doorstep. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a secure text from Maya Lin. "The board has been officially notified of a pending transformative offer. The corporate rumor mill is fully ablaze. Your stage is set." I texted back a single word: "Showtime." I arrived at the sprawling Ashworth Manor just as the lavish cocktail hour was hitting its absolute peak. Instead of walking through the grand main entrance where my parents were enthusiastically greeting guests and eagerly accepting thick envelopes of cash, I slipped in quietly through a side garden terrace. I wanted to carefully observe the battlefield before I actively stepped onto it. The garden was teeming with the absolute elite of the city's financial sector. There were women dripping in heavy diamonds and men holding expensive scotch, loudly complaining about capital gains taxes and real estate regulations. I grabbed a simple club soda with a lime from a passing waiter and stood quietly near a large stone pillar, partially hidden in the shadows. It did not take long at all. I noticed several heads turn sharply in my direction. I saw hushed, frantic whispered conversations and pointed fingers from a few older, powerful men I recognized immediately from industry magazine covers. They did not recognize me as Ethan, the disappointing failure of a younger brother. They recognized me as Ethan Vance, the reclusive, utterly ruthless founder of Nexus Tech. They looked incredibly confused, whispering urgently to each other, clearly wondering what the apex predator of the tech world was doing lurking in the shadows at a mid-tier financial firm's wedding. My cousin Oliver was the first actual family member to stumble into me. Oliver was a nice enough guy, but hopelessly oblivious to absolutely anything outside of his fantasy football league. He slapped me hard on the shoulder, nearly spilling his drink. "Ethan, Aunt Margaret said you were hiding out here in the dark. Can you believe this insane setup? Julian is a freaking king today. The open bar is incredible." I took a slow sip of my club soda, my eyes constantly scanning the dense crowd. "It is quite a party, Oliver." He chuckled, his attention already drifting toward the bartender. "So how's the computer repair thing going for you? Still working out of your apartment?" I offered a faint, razor-sharp smile. "It keeps me busy. Actually, I just had to push a major board meeting in Zurich to make it here today. The international travel is a real killer on the sleep schedule." Oliver's brain visibly short-circuited. He blinked hard. "Zurich? Like, in Switzerland?" "That's the one," I said, walking away before he could process the sheer, mind-bending absurdity of the struggling tech support guy flying private to Europe for board meetings. A few minutes later, Aunt Evelyn intercepted me near a massive, melting ice sculpture. She looked me up and down, her face clearly showing disappointment that I wasn't wearing an off-the-rack polyester suit she could mock. "Ethan, sweetheart, still trying to make a go of it in that little tech bubble of yours? You really should ask Julian to find you a real job at Blackwood. Something with a matching 401k and dental coverage. You aren't getting any younger." I stopped walking and turned to face her fully, letting my expression go completely dead and unreadable. "That is an incredibly interesting thought, Aunt Evelyn. In fact, I have been spending a very large amount of time lately thinking about the entire future of Blackwood Financial." I held her gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds until she looked physically uncomfortable and looked away. Then I gave a polite, stiff nod and walked into the grand ballroom. I was not just making idle, polite conversation. I was actively planting highly volatile landmines. I was dropping small, calculated conversational explosives that would detonate much later in their memories when the truth came out. I found my assigned seat, table 19. It was a remote, heavily shadowed outpost in the far back corner of the massive room, practically leaning against the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. It was exactly where my mother wanted me. Completely out of sight, entirely out of mind, grouped with Cousin Oliver and a few of Victoria's eccentric, elderly great-aunts who complained about the draft. The floral centerpiece was visibly smaller here. The waitstaff poured the cheap wine far less frequently. But my mother had made a severe, fatal tactical error. Table 19 offered a perfectly clear, completely unobstructed, panoramic view of the entire room, specifically the elevated head table where Julian was currently holding court. It was the ultimate strategic vantage point. I sat back in my uncomfortable chair, crossed my legs, and checked the time on my grandfather's scratched watch. The background music shifted. The appetizer plates were aggressively cleared away by the staff. The heavy hitters were taking the floor. The storm I had spent 10 years brewing was finally here. Sitting at table 19, I watched the grand spectacle of Julian's wedding reception unfold exactly like a heavily scripted, incredibly predictable corporate training video. The waitstaff moved in perfect synchrony, clearing away the imported caviar appetizers and replacing them with plates of dry, overcooked filet mignon. I took a sip of my flat club soda and observed the incredibly rigid social hierarchy of the room. The wealthiest real estate developers and senior law firm partners were seated closest to the massive, elevated head table. The further away you got from Julian and Victoria, the lower your net worth dropped. And there I was, parked right next to the swinging kitchen doors, the ultimate physical manifestation of my family's deep, unrelenting embarrassment. The speeches began, and they were an absolute masterclass in hollow, sycophantic flattery. Liam, the college friend who had happily traded our actual friendship for a low-level assistant job at Blackwood Financial, stood up to deliver the best man speech. He tapped his spoon against his crystal champagne flute, waiting for the massive room to quiet down. Liam gave a long, incredibly painful speech about Julian's supposed unmatched brilliance in the corporate world. He talked about how Julian was destined to run a financial empire, how his upcoming promotion was just the beginning of a legendary career, and how his massive new salary would secure an incredible life for Victoria. Liam did not mention me. He did not mention that the only reason Julian even had his MBA and his current job title was because I had completely sacrificed my own launch capital. He definitely did not mention the custom Porsche 911 that was currently parked in the VIP section of the Manor's driveway, secretly paid for by my stolen $50,000. I watched my mother, Margaret, dab at her dry eyes with a monogrammed napkin, looking so incredibly proud of her golden child. My father, William, nodded approvingly, mentally calculating the immense social value of the networking happening in the room. Just as the waitstaff began pouring the incredibly expensive dessert wine, I noticed a distinct, sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance swung open, and two older men walked inside. The entire room seemed to collectively hold its breath. It was Richard Blackwood, the notoriously ruthless CEO of Blackwood Financial, accompanied closely by Harrison Sterling, Victoria's father, and the real estate titan who held the keys to the company's board of directors. Blackwood looked exactly like a man who spent his entire life firing people right before the holidays. He wore a sharp, severe black suit, his silver hair slicked back, his expression a mask of permanent, arrogant displeasure. Harrison Sterling walked beside him, his eyes scanning the room with the cold, calculating gaze of a seasoned predator. Up at the head table, Julian visibly panicked. I watched my older brother physically jolt out of his chair as if he had been struck by a high-voltage electrical current. His smug, relaxed posture vanished instantly, replaced by the desperate, sweaty eagerness of a low-level employee trying to impress the boss. He hastily grabbed Victoria by the arm, nearly spilling her champagne, and practically dragged her down the steps of the head table to intercept the CEO before he could mingle with anyone else. My parents immediately fell into formation behind them, trailing in Julian's wake to soak up the reflected glory. This was the moment they had been actively preparing for. This was the exact reason they had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this wedding. They wanted to firmly cement Julian's place in the absolute upper echelon of the corporate hierarchy. Julian approached Richard Blackwood with a smile so wide and unnatural it looked like it was causing him severe physical pain. He pumped the CEO's hand enthusiastically, thanking him profusely for taking the time out of his busy schedule to attend. Blackwood offered a stiff, incredibly patronizing nod. He congratulated Julian, but his eyes were already wandering around the room, clearly looking for more important people to talk to. Harrison Sterling stood slightly behind Blackwood. He caught my eye across the massive ballroom. He gave me a single, nearly imperceptible nod. The green light. Julian, desperate to keep the CEO's attention, decided to deploy his favorite party trick. He decided to elevate himself by aggressively stepping on me. I watched the exact moment the terrible idea formed in his head. He pointed a finger across the room, directly at my dark corner by the kitchen doors. He leaned in and said something to Richard Blackwood, gesturing for the CEO to follow him. They began walking. The procession of doom was heading straight for table 19. Julian was leading the CEO of Blackwood Financial, his powerful new father-in-law, his beautiful bride, and both of our beaming parents directly toward my remote outpost. The conversations at the neighboring tables sputtered and died as people turned to watch the heavy hitters move across the floor. My cousin Oliver abruptly stopped chewing his steak, his eyes wide with sudden panic as the billionaire CEO approached our cheap table. Julian stopped right in front of me, radiating pure, toxic arrogance. He crossed his arms over his expensive tuxedo jacket and looked down at me. "Richard," Julian announced, his voice booming artificially loud, so the surrounding tables could hear every single word. "I want to introduce you to the rest of the family. This guy sitting right here in the dark is my younger brother, Ethan." Julian paused, letting the silence stretch out, ensuring everyone was paying close attention to his punchline. He gestured toward me with a completely dismissive, highly insulting flick of his wrist. "Ethan is a bit of a dreamer. He plays around with computers. He runs his own little tiny consulting shop out of a rented apartment. He struggles a bit with the real world, but we love him anyway. He is always asking me for corporate advice." My mother let out a high, incredibly fake laugh, chiming in to support the narrative. My father just shook his head, looking deeply embarrassed that I was even sitting there. They were serving me up on a silver platter to entertain a man they desperately wanted to impress. They wanted to show Richard Blackwood that Julian was the successful, grounded executive, while I was the pathetic, struggling charity case of the family. I did not break eye contact with Julian. I did not show an ounce of anger. I sat perfectly still in my bespoke charcoal suit, my hands resting lightly on the table, feeling the cold, hard metal of my grandfather's beat-up watch against my wrist. I waited for Richard Blackwood to look at me. I waited for the trap to snap completely shut. Richard Blackwood turned his head, a polite, incredibly strained smile of social obligation plastered across his face. He looked down at the table, fully expecting to see a pathetic, low-level tech support guy awkwardly avoiding his gaze. Instead, he saw me looking directly back into his soul. I watched the exact sequence of events unfold on the CEO's face in ultra-slow motion. First, his eyes simply glazed over with boredom. Then, as his brain finally processed my facial features, my tailored suit, and the cold, unblinking intensity of my stare, his eyes widened dramatically. The polite, arrogant smile completely vanished from his face, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated, blinding shock. Richard Blackwood physically recoiled. He took a fast, stumbling step backward, ripping his arm away from Julian's friendly grasp as if he had just touched a burning stove. The sudden, violent shift in his entire demeanor was so abrupt and so incredibly total that it created an instant vacuum of dead silence around our entire section of the ballroom. Julian's triumphant, arrogant expression faltered. It melted instantly into a mask of utter, profound confusion. He looked at his boss, then back at me, completely failing to understand why the powerful CEO looked like he had just seen a ghost holding a loaded weapon. Blackwood took a hesitant, trembling step forward. He was no longer looking at a subordinate's pathetic little brother. He was looking at a man who currently held his entire professional future, his massive salary, and his golden parachute retirement package completely in the palm of his hand. "Mr. Vance," Blackwood said. His voice was a low, incredibly respectful murmur that was somehow 10 times more powerful and commanding than Julian's loud, booming introduction. Blackwood extended his hand, not casually, but formally, his fingers actually trembling. I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea you would be in attendance tonight. I was not informed by the board that you were on the guest list." The silence in the room spread like spilled ink. The string quartet stopped playing. My father and mother, who had been aggressively basking in the warm glow of Julian's perceived power just seconds ago, now looked on with expressions of complete, horrifying bewilderment. I stood up from the table. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting the harsh scrape of my wooden chair on the marble floor echo loudly through the dead silence. I reached out and took his offered hand. My handshake was firm, calculated, and authoritative. His palm was completely clammy with cold sweat. "Richard," I said, my voice incredibly calm, clear, and projected perfectly. I deliberately used his first name with an easy, dominant familiarity that was a massive power statement all on its own. "There is absolutely no need to apologize to me. It is a family event. I am simply here in a personal capacity." I offered a slight, razor-sharp smile. "At least for now." Julian's head was swiveling back and forth between the two of us like a panicked spectator at a high-speed tennis match. His brain was completely failing to process the data in front of him. Wait, hold on a second," Julian stammered, his voice cracking, losing all of its previous arrogant bass. "What is going on here? Richard, you too. You actually know each other." I finally released the CEO's sweating hand and turned my full, undivided attention directly to my older brother. The exact moment I had painstakingly replayed in my mind 1,000 times, over 10 long years, in 1,000 different variations, was finally here. And it was more incredibly perfect than I could have ever dreamed. I let him hang there in his utter confusion for 3 agonizingly long seconds. I let him feel the ground disappearing beneath his expensive Italian shoes. "Oh, we know each other quite well, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly level but carrying a heavy edge of cold, unforgiving steel that sliced effortlessly through the silence. "We have been in highly extensive, confidential corporate negotiations for the past 8 months. Haven't we, Richard?" Richard Blackwood just nodded stiffly, his face completely pale. He looked exactly like a condemned man who had just realized his executioner was a guest at his dinner party. Julian forced a high, nervous, incredibly unnatural laugh. "Negotiations? What the hell are you talking about, Ethan? You run a tiny, 2-man computer repair shop out of your dirty apartment. What could you possibly be negotiating with the CEO of Blackwood Financial?" "That is exactly where you are wrong, Julian," I said, my voice never rising in volume, yet completely commanding the undivided attention of every single wealthy guest within earshot. "You see, you were always so incredibly busy looking down your nose at my tiny firm that you never once bothered to actually look at it. You never once asked what my company was even called." I paused, letting the heavy indictment hang in the stagnant air. "It is called Nexus Tech, and it is not a little consulting shop. It is a global logistics and technology acquisition firm. And as for our ongoing negotiations," I looked past Julian, making direct eye contact with the CEO. "Richard is fully aware of Project Nightingale." At the explicit mention of the highly classified code name, a visible flicker of genuine, primal fear crossed Richard Blackwood's face. Harrison Sterling, standing quietly behind the CEO, allowed himself a small, grim, highly satisfied smile. Project Nightingale, I continued, turning my cold gaze back to my completely stunned family, is the operational internal name for our 100% hostile stock acquisition of a legacy financial firm that has entirely failed to adapt to the modern market. A poorly managed firm by the name of Blackwood Financial. A collective, massive gasp went through the neighboring tables. Aunt Evelyn covered her mouth with her hand. My mother's jaw actually dropped open. My father's face, which had been a solid mask of intense pride just moments before, morphed into a terrifying canvas of pure disbelief and absolute horror. Julian just stared at me, his eyes wide, the words completely refusing to process in his arrogant brain. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that is not possible. You do not have that kind of capital. You are broke." "Not only is it entirely possible, Julian, it is a legally binding, completely done deal," I said, ruthlessly pressing my immense advantage. "The board of directors is meeting on Monday morning at 8 o'clock as a strict formality to approve my final offer. An offer which, I might add, is the absolute only thing currently standing between Blackwood Financial and a massive Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing." I stepped closer to him. I looked at his expensive tuxedo. I thought about my $50,000. I thought about the Porsche 911. And then I delivered the final, beautiful, devastating blow. I gave him a look of profound, unfiltered pity, the exact same look he had given me my entire life. "So to answer your question, Julian, yes, Richard and I know each other. And come Monday morning, our professional relationship will be much, much simpler. You will be the low-level employee, and I will be the man who personally signs your paychecks. Assuming, of course, that your redundant position even still exists after my team initiates the massive corporate restructuring." The sound of the impact was completely explosive. Victoria, the beautiful, incredibly brittle bride, stood absolutely frozen in place. Her face was a horrific mask of dawning realization. Her fingers went completely numb. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her hand. It hit the marble floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, sending a puddle of expensive champagne splashing across the polished stone. It was a perfect, incredibly violent punctuation mark to the absolute end of her perfect, golden, financially secure world. My mother finally found her voice. It was a shrill, highly panicked, desperate cry. "Ethan, this is a lie. It has to be a sick joke. You cannot possibly do this to your brother on his wedding day. You do not have this kind of money." "It is no joke, Margaret," I said, using her first name, entirely devoid of any familial emotion. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket. I pulled out my phone. I opened the locked screen directly to the high-resolution scan of the email from 10 years ago. I held the bright screen up so she, my father, and Julian could all read it clearly. The words, "Thank you, honey. You are a lifesaver. Julian will pay you back," are glowing right here on this screen. Just like the $50,000 cash loan I gave Julian for his MBA tuition wasn't a joke. The money that was supposed to secure his brilliant future and his massive new salary. The money that he instead used to buy a custom Porsche 911 while I ate ramen noodles in a freezing apartment. The money that was never, ever paid back. The public airing of that highly toxic secret, that ugly, unspoken family debt, was the ultimate crushing humiliation. The room wasn't just silent now. It was a complete vacuum. And in the dead center of it, my family was finally, truly seeing me for the very first time. They were not looking at a failure. They were looking at an apex predator they had accidentally created. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The air in the grand ballroom was dangerously thick with unspoken, terrifying questions. The wealthy wedding guests were awkwardly pretending they were not listening, but every single pair of eyes in the room was fixed directly on our family drama. The string quartet had completely packed up their instruments. The only sound was the low, electric hum of vicious gossip spreading from table to table like a wildfire. "We are not doing this out here," I said. My voice was low, firm, and left absolutely zero room for negotiation. I gestured with my head toward a set of heavy, dark oak doors near the back of the room marked Private VIP Lounge. I did not wait for them to agree. I simply turned my back on them and walked away, entirely confident that the sheer gravity of the crisis would force them to follow me. The gravitational pull of absolute ruin is an incredibly powerful thing. I heard the sharp scuff of their expensive shoes on the marble floor right behind me. I heard my father's heavy, angry strides, my mother's hesitant, panicked clicks in her heels, and Julian's stumbling, completely defeated shuffle. Victoria, to her credit, followed right behind them, her face heavily streaked with ruined mascara, but her back rigidly straight. I walked into the VIP room and firmly closed the heavy oak doors behind us, instantly cutting off the noise of the ballroom. The sudden, suffocating silence in the room was far more deafening than the gossip outside. The room was incredibly opulent and highly claustrophobic, filled with dark velvet chairs, heavy mahogany tables, and old oil paintings of dead aristocrats. It felt exactly like a high-stakes courtroom preparing for a sentencing hearing. Julian, predictably, was the very first person to completely break. His sheer terror had rapidly curdled into a desperate, wildly impotent rage. "You absolute son of a bitch!" he screamed, his voice cracking horribly, completely losing all of his carefully manicured corporate composure. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You planned this. You came here to my wedding, in front of my boss, in front of my wife's family, to completely ruin my life." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, looking at him like he was a highly complex math problem I had already solved years ago. "Your life?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm and incredibly quiet. "Let us be perfectly clear about the facts, Julian. Your life, as you currently know it, was nothing but a highly leveraged syndicated loan. Your parents were the primary financial investors, heavily subsidizing your lifestyle, and I was the forced minority shareholder. You all cashed out my dreams without telling me to buy yourself a luxury sports car and a fake job title." I took a single step toward him. "I did not ruin your life, Julian. I just finally called in a bad debt." My mother rushed forward, her hands outstretched in a frantic, desperate pleading gesture. The arrogant country club matriarch from 20 minutes ago was completely gone. "Ethan, please, you have to stop this immediately," she sobbed, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "Whatever you think we did to you in the past, we can fix it. We can make it right. We can pay you back the $50,000 tomorrow. We are a family." "A family?" I shot back, the word tasting like pure poison in my mouth. "Is that really what you think this is? A family is a mutual support system, Margaret. It is not a toxic pyramid scheme with one golden beneficiary sitting at the absolute top, draining everyone else dry. You did not just ignore my dreams. You actively, intentionally siphoned resources away from them to fund his fragile ego. You used me." My father, William, who had remained furiously silent until this exact moment, finally stepped forward. His face was a thunderous mask of pure fury. He tried desperately to reclaim his fading power, to use the deep, authoritative voice that had aggressively commanded corporate boardrooms and dominated Thanksgiving dinners for decades. "That is absolutely enough of this garbage," my father snarled, pointing a stiff finger at my chest. "I do not know what kind of delusional fantasy you are living in, but you will stop this embarrassing nonsense right now. I will not have you publicly humiliate this family. I will call my corporate lawyers first thing in the morning. We will fight this hostile takeover in federal court. We will bury you in litigation." I actually laughed. It was a cold, incredibly dry sound that held absolutely no humor. It was just pathetic. "You are going to call your lawyers?" I said, slowly shaking my head in pure disbelief. Dad, you are so incredibly far out of your depth right now that you cannot even see the surface of the water. While you have been obsessively worrying about which dark corner to seat me in tonight, I have spent the last 8 months working with a massive team of the most ruthless, expensive corporate acquisition lawyers in the entire country. We already have the majority shares. We have the absolute shareholder support. We have the ironclad backing of the key board members. I slowly shifted my gaze over to Victoria, who was standing perfectly still, looking like she was about to be physically sick. That backing deeply includes your brand new father-in-law, Harrison Sterling, I said smoothly, who, as it turns out, is deeply, profoundly concerned about his daughter's vast inheritance and financial future being permanently tied to an incredibly incompetent, arrogant executive who buys Porsches with stolen money. The fight is already over, Dad. You just completely failed to hear the bell. The explicit mention of her father's direct involvement was a devastating, direct hit on Victoria. She visibly flinched, her last remaining bastion of emotional and financial support completely crumbling into dust. My father? Victoria whispered, her voice trembling violently. He knew about this takeover? He did a lot more than just know about it, Victoria, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. I actually felt a tiny flicker of genuine pity for her. She was collateral damage, a clueless casualty in a massive war she didn't even know was being fought. He actively encouraged it. He called my private cell phone personally. He sees Julian exactly for what he is, a terrible, highly toxic investment. This was never just about a petty sibling rivalry. It is about business. And in the world of high-level finance, blind sentiment is a massive liability. Julian looked as if I had taken a baseball bat and physically struck him across the face. His legs gave out. He sank heavily into one of the dark velvet chairs, staring blankly at the expensive Persian rug. All the arrogant fight, all the manufactured corporate bravado, completely drained out of him. He was replaced by a hollow, vacant shell of a man. He looked entirely broken. I turned my attention away from him and looked directly at my parents. They were standing close together, looking older, smaller, and incredibly fragile. For 10 long years, I have lived in the dark shadow of a toxic myth that you two intentionally created, I said, my tone completely flat and clinical. The myth of the brilliant, golden son, and the pathetic, struggling disappointment. You constantly measured my worth in comparison to his fake achievements, and you always found me lacking. You never once stopped to think that maybe we were running entirely different races. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the heavy oak doors. I had said absolutely everything I needed to say. The power dynamic in the room and in my entire life had been permanently, irrevocably altered. I put my hand on the cold brass doorknob. I did not do this just to hurt you, I said, looking over my shoulder one last time. It was the truest thing I had said all night. I did this to finally force you to look at me, to see exactly who I really am, without the heavy, suffocating filter of your disappointment. The massive company restructuring will begin in exactly 2 weeks. My legal office will be in touch regarding the termination of Julian's position. Until then, I suggest you try and enjoy the open bar. I opened the door and walked out, leaving them entirely alone in the complete wreckage of their manufactured lives. The 3 intense months immediately following the wedding were a brutal, highly exhilarating blur of corporate restructuring. The hostile acquisition of Blackwood Financial was front-page news in the Wall Street Journal and every major financial paper in the country. The media pundits called it a shocking, brilliant coup by the industry's most enigmatic, ruthless player. The public narrative was simply that a massive tech upstart had effortlessly devoured a bloated Wall Street dinosaur. Absolutely no one in the press knew the real, highly toxic family drama that had been the secret, burning engine driving the entire affair. My very first order of business as the new owner was a complete, merciless overhaul of the entire executive team. I brought in my trusted people from Nexus Tech, led by Maya Lin. We acted like highly trained surgeons, coldly and efficiently cutting away the financial rot that had been slowly killing the company from the inside for years. Bloated, useless departments were immediately streamlined. Massive, wasteful vanity projects were permanently shuttered. Redundant, high-paying executive positions were entirely eliminated. Liam, the best man who had sold out our friendship for a tiny taste of corporate power, was fired on day 2. He tried to email me, begging for a second chance, talking about our college days. I had Maya Lin forward his email directly to HR with instructions to cancel his severance package. I did not fire Julian. I easily could have. Absolutely no one on the board would have blinked an eye. It would have been instantly justified as a simple, highly logical business decision based on his catastrophic performance metrics. But simply firing him felt far too incredibly easy. Firing him would have allowed him to play the eternal victim. It would have allowed him to be a tragic martyr in my parents' eyes. Instead, I let him sweat. I left him in a state of suspended corporate animation for exactly 4 weeks. He was still officially on the payroll, but he had absolutely no duties, no staff, no office, and his keycard access to the executive floors was completely revoked. He was a pathetic ghost haunting the lower hallways of the company he once arrogantly thought he would run. Finally, I summoned him to my office. It was Richard Blackwood's former corner suite, a massive, cavernous space that I had completely stripped of its old dark wood and stuffy leather. I replaced it with cold glass, brushed steel, and a sweeping view of the city. It was my absolute territory now. Julian walked in looking like he had aged 10 years in a single month. He had visibly lost weight. The thick, suffocating arrogance that had been his defining personality trait since childhood was completely gone, replaced by a deep, incredibly weary uncertainty. He stood awkwardly in front of my massive desk. "Ethan," he began, his voice raspy and weak. I am incredibly sorry. About the money. About everything." "Save it," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Apologies are for family. In this room, we are strictly colleagues. And as your superior colleague, I have to be completely honest. Your performance record is an absolute embarrassment. By any normal corporate metric, you should have been terminated 2 years ago." I saw him flinch violently, but he said absolutely nothing. He just stood there and took the verbal beating. "However," I continued, leaning back in my chair, "I am a firm believer in raw data. And the data I currently have on you is flawed. It only shows how you perform when absolutely everything in life is handed to you on a silver platter. It does not show how you perform when you actually have to earn your keep." I slid a single sheet of paper across the sleek glass desk. It was an internal job posting. "There is a position open on the ground floor. It is a junior data analyst role on the Midwest logistics team. It is incredibly tedious data entry. It is report generation. It is absolute grunt work. The base salary is significantly less than your current monthly mortgage payment on that house Victoria's father bought you. You will be working directly for a manager named Maria, who is 28 years old and has absolutely zero patience for excuses or laziness. There will be no shortcuts. There will be no special treatment. Your last name will mean absolutely nothing to her." Julian stared down at the piece of paper. It was the most profound, humiliating insult I could have possibly delivered to him, and simultaneously, the absolute only real, genuine opportunity he had ever been given in his entire life. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a broken whisper. "Because for my entire life, I have had to aggressively prove my worth to everyone," I said, leaning forward, resting my arms on the desk. "Now, Julian, it is your turn. You can take this job and you can learn this business from the absolute bottom up, exactly the way you should have 10 years ago. Or you can walk out that glass door right now with a basic severance package and never, ever look back. The choice, for the very first time in your life, is completely yours." He stood there in complete silence for what felt like an absolute eternity. I could literally see the massive psychological war playing out behind his tired eyes. His massive pride was violently warring with his sheer terror. The humiliation of the demotion was warring with the incredibly faint glimmer of a real lifeline. Finally, with a badly trembling hand, he reached out and picked up the piece of paper. "Okay," he whispered, avoiding my eyes. "Okay, I will do it." He walked out of my office, not as a fallen, arrogant prince, but as something entirely new and uncertain. And for the very first time in my life, looking at my brother, I felt a tiny flicker of something that was not burning anger or deep resentment. My parents retreated into a shell of deeply wounded silence for a long time. Eventually, they requested a formal meeting. They walked into my office looking small and incredibly out of place against the backdrop of the sweeping city views. This was my absolute kingdom, and they were merely supplicants. My father looked completely humbled. He sat in the chair in front of my desk, clasping his hands together tightly. He broke down and finally confessed the deeply buried truth. He told me that 10 years ago, he had secretly called his contacts at the bank to ensure my initial business loan was officially denied. He had actively sabotaged me. "Why?" I asked, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. He looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "Because I was a terrifying coward, Ethan. I grew up dirt poor. My father, your grandfather Benjamin, was the greatest man I ever knew, but he struggled for pennies his entire life. Every single day was a brutal battle for survival. I clawed my way into a life of corporate security, and I was absolutely terrified of my children falling back down into that poverty. When I looked at Julian climbing the safe corporate ladder, it made sense to me. But when I looked at you, with your massive risks and crazy tech ideas, you looked exactly like your grandfather. You looked like a dreamer, and it terrified me. I thought I was protecting you from a life of financial ruin by crushing your dreams." My mother sat next to him, weeping silently, apologizing for being so incredibly blinded by her own fear of failure that she actively sacrificed one son to protect the other. It was a terrible, completely unforgivable mistake. Their confession did not magically fix everything. It did not instantly erase 10 years of profound pain, financial theft, and emotional neglect. But it was the absolute truth. A truth far more complex, sad, and deeply human than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. They had not been pure evil monsters. They had just been incredibly flawed, deeply frightened people passing down their own generational trauma and financial insecurities like a toxic family heirloom. I did not offer them instant forgiveness, but I offered them a starting point. I told them we could try having dinner once a month, strictly on my terms, in neutral territory. It was a chance to slowly clear away the massive rubble and see if absolutely anything was actually worth rebuilding. Late at night, when the massive Nexus Tech office is completely quiet and the entire city is just a glittering carpet of lights far below my window, I often open my desk drawer. I take out my grandfather's beat-up watch. The leather is completely frayed. The crystal glass is hopelessly scratched. By all objective financial measures, it is entirely worthless. But it remains the absolute most valuable thing I own in this world. I used to think my greatest, ultimate victory was that explosive day at the wedding. The glorious moment I finally laid my family's massive hypocrisy bare for all the wealthy guests to see. But I was incredibly wrong. That was not the real victory. That was just the brutal breaking of a terrible fever. The real victory came in the quiet, peaceful moments that slowly followed. My grandfather's handwritten note is now professionally framed on my office wall. A man's worth isn't what he has in the bank. It is what he builds. For a very long time, I thought he strictly meant building a massive company, a massive empire of glass, steel, and high-yield stock portfolios. But I have finally come to realize he meant something infinitely more important. He meant aggressively building a life of absolute integrity. Building strong boundaries based on truth, even when the truth is incredibly painful. Building a future that is honestly, truly, and entirely your own. Success, I have finally learned, is never a final destination you arrive at. It is not a single, explosive act of public revenge or a dramatic moment of vindication. It is the quiet, daily, relentless act of choosing to believe in yourself, especially when absolutely no one else does. And that is a solid foundation that no toxic family, no stolen college fund, and no arrogant older brother can ever shake. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I truly hope it resonated with you in some meaningful way. Have you ever been in a difficult situation where you felt completely underestimated, betrayed, or pushed aside by your own family? I would be incredibly honored if you shared your own personal story in the comments below. And please, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next journey we take together.